stand to become Christians. And people came down in very definite lines. And there were many. I haven't heard it said at some of our lectureships. Worship on Sunday is for the church, not the unbeliever. And so when people came to me and said, hey, is the worship of the church for believers or unbelievers? The believer side would say, well, all things are to be done for the edification of the church. Right? Paul said that. 1 Corinthians chapter 14. I would say, is it for the believers? Yes. Is it for the unbelievers? Yes. Because there's never a moment in time when God is not unconcerned about those who don't know Him. God is always in the business of drawing lost people to Himself. If Jesus came to seek and save the lost, certainly when the people of God are gathered, it's a right thing to always be about the things that Jesus was about. And so it seemed to me to be just a moot point. Of course it's for both. In 1 Corinthians 14, Paul made it very clear that when the church comes together, one of the reasons you don't want chaos like they had in Corinth was because an unbeliever might come in. And what Paul wanted to see happen at verse 25 was that when an unbeliever would come in to the assembly of the saints, he'd be moved and convicted in his heart. The secrets of his heart would be disclosed. And Paul said, and so, falling on his face, he will worship God and declare that God is really among them. You see, when Paul and Silas were in prison singing hymns, this wasn't just for them. They were bearing witness to the other prisoners to the goodness of God. Because it says that the others were listening to them. When David spoke about worship, he said in Psalm 96:3, declare His glory among the nations, His marvelous deeds among all peoples, for great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. In our praise, declare His glory to who? The nations. And who were those nations? They were the unbelievers who didn't know God. Israel was made, they forgot this. They were created to be a light to the Gentiles, not to keep God to themselves. But they kind of got in this place where they thought, God's ours. He's not yours. And they lost their witness. So, who was worship for? Again, back in 1 Chronicles 16:8, David said, oh, give thanks to the Lord, call upon His name, make known His deeds among the peoples. Verse 24, declare His glory among the nations. So folks, when we gather in here on the Lord's Day, when we come together, it's not just us. This isn't just a little holy huddle for the saints. And one of the reasons when you worship that you ought to sing out and declare the greatness of God and not keep this to yourself. And one of the reasons this ought to be a house of praise is because this ought to be a place where the people of the community around us can come in and be so moved and convicted by what they're hearing come out of your mouth that it causes them to want to worship and glorify God. Listen, one of the things I know that the gathering of the church is not, it's not entertainment for the congregation. Every one of us comes and we're a minister of God. Every one of us comes as a priest to offer what Hebrews chapter 13 calls a sacrifice of praise coming from our lips. And it's not just for us. It's not just for our power. It's so that the people who come in will know. And I'll tell you, one of the most compelling witnesses for unbelievers is when they come into a church that is on fire for God, that has a sense of His glory and grandeur, for whom Jesus Christ is enthroned as Lord, and the witness of Jesus goes out from that church, His worthiness, and it moves the heart of unbelieving people and brings them to Christ. I think one of the reasons so many of our churches aren't reaching people is that so many of us in the pews haven't been reached with the greatness and grandeur of God. How can we reach those with that which we do not possess ourselves? So when you come together, may this be a house of prayer and a house of praise, where when people come to Palm Desert Church of Christ, they go away saying, man, it was good to be in that place. My heart's more open to God than it's ever been. Not only were those people loving on me, man, they really love their God. One last thing, then we're going to close. I'm going to end here. Praise restores hope. That's the last thing it does. When my father-in-law, who was a missionary in Africa, was in the hospital in Zimbabwe in Harare, he'd suffered for years with extreme rheumatoid arthritis. And his body had been so racked by this disease. Here was a man that was such a faithful servant of God. He was converted in his 40s, ended up spending the last almost 20 years of his life in Zimbabwe, going out to tribal trust land areas and planting churches out among the Shona people, learned the language in his 40s and just shared Christ with those folks and led many to Christ. He was laying on a hospital bed when we first got to Harare. And we went in to see him, and we hardly recognized him. His body had just been racked by the disease. And he asked me to pray for him. And so I started to pray, and I bowed, and I said, God, would you please take this pain away from Rob? We love him, and we know you love him. Would you please alleviate his suffering? And Rob hit my hand and said, stop. And I'd never been told to stop in the middle of a prayer before. But I stopped. He said, Kevin, don't pray that prayer. Don't do it. I have prayed that prayer for years, and God has chosen to say, no, I'm going to let you suffer. You pray and ask God that I will glorify him in my body. That's the heart of a man who's walked with God. That's the heart of a man who doesn't look at God and blame God and wallow in why. This is a man who's walked with God. And so there he is. And one of the things we noticed was that the members of the Avondale Church of Christ, which was kind of his home base, they would come and gather around him in that hospital room, 4 and 5 of them, and they would always bring hymn books. And they would always sing the hymns that you and I know and love. Oh, how I love Jesus. 'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus. And as he sang those hymns, his eyes would light up, and a smile would come on his face. Those songs had shaped him. But now in his final days, those songs were reminding him of his great God, and those songs were giving him the hope that he desperately needed as he came toward the end.